Hello, and welcome back to another close reading. Last episode, we took a look at a song by Fuamoko, so I thought it would be fun to sort of continue that and take a look at In My Feelings by Nerissa Ravencroft. So basically what this little series is I'm basically dusting off my English degree and doing a sort of a close reading and annotation of poetic devices and techniques that are being used in media that isn't explicitly being presented as a poem. Obviously, songwriting and poetry have a lot in common, but they are still two different fields. But it's fun to see, especially in the lyric writing, where that poetry really comes out. So, yeah. If that sounds fun to you, get a cup of coffee. This tends to be pretty niche and in-depth, but it's a lot of fun. So, yeah, with that, let's jump right into the first verse. So here we have the first verse, and taking a quick look at some of the things we want to run through right in the get-go. We've got some rhyming sounds. We've got mouth and route. So while their endings aren't rhyming, that sort of internal part is rhyming. Then we've got ticking and thinking. We've got those king sounds here. And then me is sort of a near rhyme to thinking, sort of, for the E sound at the end. And then we also have tormenting as rhyming the ing, ing right there. We also have a bit of a rhyme with memories and me, in that since they're describing a collection of memories, it's plural, it has to be memories, but memory and me, those rhyme. So there's sort of like almost an implied rhyme between those two. But let's also take a look at this as a whole and sort of see, this is the introduction to the song, this introduction to the piece. Let's see what we can learn about the speaker, what's going on in the situation, what they might be talking about, all of that stuff. So they start off strong with "can't believe the words that came out of your mouth." So already it's almost like an in media res type situation where we're starting right in the action. It almost seems as if some sort of fight or disagreement has already occurred, and so now we're almost sitting sort of in the aftermath of that. So here we have "can't believe the words that came out of your mouth. Never thought that we would go this route." So by using the use of "we" here, we already see that they have, a pretty strong connection to this other person. This isn't, this isn't going to be a poem about a random neighbor said something crazy that Nerissa is still thinking about, or even like a boss. This seems to be something of a romantic connection, because there's also this implied that, well, if Nerissa, or the speaker of this poem, never thought that they would go this route, it implies that they did think and were actively thinking that they would go a different way. And so having considered that they were considering that, there was clearly a significant connection between the two of them. They can see the clock is ticking, but I just can't stop thinking. Every little memory's tormenting me. So here the clock is not only serving as sort of a image of time is passing, but it's also going to lead into an image that we're going to see later of sort of a restlessness. Because on the one hand, a clock ticking can imply that there's a passage of time, and since we're already in the aftermath, we're not only in the aftermath of this fight, but we're also potentially in the aftermath of this relationship as a whole. And so, the fact that the speaker is noticing this clock means that they're aware of the fact that the more time goes on, the more these two separate and get further and further from each other. The use of "but" here is interesting, because it means that even though they are aware of passing time, they still can't help themselves from thinking about every little memory. And so that implies that they've realized that the passage of time should soften the wound, or, make this distance and this potential breakup should sort of soften the blow. Despite this, they just can't stop thinking about it. And every little memory is tormenting them. So to look at some actual like 19th century poetry, so some like historical poetry that has had a great influence on a great deal of writing, this whole opening verse slash stanza, if it's a poem, reminds me a lot of the writing of Lord Byron. So Lord Byron was an extremely influential writer in the 19th century. Sometimes his work is categorized as just being English romantic. Sometimes it is classified as being dark romantic. And some of his writing is even tied into the Gothic. And what's cool about Nerissa Ravencroft is that her sort of persona and sort of stage presence, etc., kind of is reminiscent of this dark romanticism Gothic movement. Ravens we associate with Edgar Allan Poe. He's an American romantic slash American Gothic writer. Lord Byron is an English romantic writer and poet, but he created what is known as the Byronic hero, which is sort of this this dramatic, larger-than-life persona and character in the poetry that is tormented by romance. And so this is sort of the prototype of like brooding on the cliffs and watching as the sea rages. And usually the thing that a Byronic hero is brooding about is like past mistakes, regrets, and romances, and like unrequited love and things like that. So considering that our piece here today starts immediately with a speaker who is in a state of disbelief, their time is passing by, they can hear the clock ticking, but they're still just brooded and they're tormented by these memories. We're clearly in Byronic hero territory here. What's also interesting is a cool thing with poetry that's one of my favorite things to look at when I'm analyzing a piece is the way that if you look at the last words of each line, you sort of get you can kind of get a meaning of what the stanza is saying, even just with those. So mouth, that immediately brings to mind ideas of communication, but also it's usually a romantic image. If one character in a story, for example, keeps focusing on another character's mouth or is describing the way their lips look, etc., there's usually a romantic undertone to that. Or, again, mouth is a form of communication. And so just looking at that word, we can see that, looking back at the line, yes, it's about them discussing a communication and their disbelief of the words that were spoken in it. Route is, a form of travel, but it can also be, if you go on separate routes, you can converge your routes and go in separate directions. So it both has to do with transitioning and that sort of process of travel and moving, etc. But it can also have to do with a route from one thing to another. So both, if they're going in separate routes, they're going apart from each other, but also on an emotional level, a character can go on a route and go from one state of mind to another. Thinking, clearly this is a character who is brooding, they're thinking about things and also thinking about the past, and they are very much, thinking is internal. And I mean, The song is called In My Feelings. So this is clearly someone who is, the main action of this poem, the main conflict and everything is going to be happening within their mind, within their feelings. So thinking is obviously a very important thing. And then me, we get, and that is ultimately, we're getting that implication that this is a poem or a song about the speaker and about them and their relationship to themselves and others, because they are in their feelings. So it's very much like they're alone, me, just alone. I'm not in a group, I'm by myself, all of that. So just a fun little thing that when you're looking at those, you can really see, you can kind of just take those and sort of get the meaning of the stanza as a whole. So yeah, let's jump into the next part. All right, so here we get our first pre-chorus, and here we have some rhymes going on. We've got mistakes and break. They're not exact rhymes, they're a bit more near rhymes. Happen doesn't seem to rhyme with anything, though. It's the end sound is sort of similar to and. Then we get own, there, you. Nothing else too clear with that. However, let's jump into the actual language, and there's some interesting things. So here we have our. So here the speaker of the poem is placing blame on both parties. They aren't counting the mistakes that the other person just made, because otherwise that would be your mistakes, and they're also not just blaming themselves, or else they would be counting all of my mistakes, but instead they are counting our, which also further cements the fact that the speaker of this stanza in this poem still sort of thinks of this other person and themselves as being a collective, because by counting our mistakes, they're still putting them mentally together as a group rather as two separate individuals. They want to sleep, but it won't happen. They're waiting for the daybreak. I'm wide awake, reliving the past, and still haunted by the ghost of you. Everywhere I look, it's like you're always there, despite the fact that I'm on my own. So what's really cool about this too is their use of imagery and sort of metaphor. So at this point in the poem, it's not fully clear if the other person that Nerissa / the speaker is talking about, whether they're dead or whether they're merely broken up. So we don't know if that division has been caused by one or the other. It seems to be more of a breakup, and therefore the ghost is metaphorical, but technically this far it could be something else. But here then, if ghost of you is a metaphor, then what they're really describing is sort of that sense of it's an internal ghost. So if the speaker is walking around their house and seeing images of this other person, there's not really a ghost there, but it's a mentally created ghost, which is a very romantic sentiment. And I mean romantic with a capital R, as in the Romanticism movement, because that's all about implying the internal through your inward eye and how you project your emotions and your inward thinking mind onto the world around you. And also, they're putting value in this ghost by allowing it to haunt them. So with, English Romanticism is a response to the Enlightenment movement, and the Enlightenment movement was all about, science and math and rationality, and it sort of condemned the irrational. So emotions and dreams and things that weren't logical were seen as having not value. As a response to that, the Romantic movement started to say no, like the irrational has an impact, has value, and also can have strength. So here Nerissa is saying that just this essentially made up ghost, it's a ghost comprised of her emotions and her memories. It has the power to haunt her and to be giving her this sort of torment. It's also cool, as we were talking about how Nerissa Ravencroft sort of has a bit of a gothic aesthetic. Her use of imagery and metaphor feels very connected. So we have we start off with a degree of sleeplessness and restlessness, which also implies that it is, it's nighttime and she's hearing the clock ticking. And now she's restless, and now she's starting to see ghosts, or just a ghost, which is the ghost of the other person. So all of these images fit together really well. Something that you see in more amateuric poetry is sort of when they use a metaphor or an image that doesn't really connect. So, sometimes if a little kid is writing a poem about their dead grandmother, and they want to describe something that they like their grandmother, so they compare their grandmother to a delicious slice of pizza because they like pizza and pizza brings them joy. But, to an adult audience, it feels weird to compare a dead relative to a piece of pizza. Here, however, we're seeing that all these connections, because also we think of ghosts as coming at night, we think of them as haunting the restless, and we also think of ghosts as having that complicated relationship between they can sometimes be the ghost of someone you love, but they can also be a source of anguish. Seeing the ghost of someone you love isn't always a happy reunion, but it can actually be, a negative experience. And then also, let's take a look at the last words in all of this. So we have, let me change my font color. So we have mistakes, happen, daybreak, and you, there, and own. So mistakes tells us that, a mistake is a negative connotation of something that happened that wasn't supposed to happen, but it also usually refers to something that doesn't have too much ill intent. So, the first verse states that Nerissa can't believe what this other person said. But at this point in the poem, Nerissa seems to still be thinking of that cruel thing the other person said as being a mistake. And they still think of it, as us and our. So we're getting a sense of where they're applying their moral compass. Happen, that is stating, that's something that happened in the past. It happened in the past. Things happen, a recurrence. So we get a recurrence, thing in the past. You're ruminating on something in the past. Daybreak, usually you think of daybreak as a transition. It's between night and day, and it's usually a positive transition. So again, you want the sun to rise. When the sun rises, usually the ghosts go away and all the badness goes away. And with this, they're waiting for daybreak, which means they are still within the night. They are within the night. They're within their agony, within their torment, all of that. And is a connecting word. It connects two things. And this whole poem seems to be about the connection of two people and, maybe the breaking up of that connection. Clearly the speaker of this poem is still somewhat emotionally obsessed or invested in this other person, whoever this you is. There is interesting because there is a word that is chosen based on one's relation to something. So right now I am holding a stylus that I'm using to sort of annotate this. So I would describe the stylus as being right here because it is close to me, I'm holding it, it is within my possession. If my stylus was in another room and was away from me and apart from me and I couldn't see it, I would say, oh, the stylus is over there. So it's all about it, whether you use here or there, it depends on the person who is perceiving that object and their relation and spatial relation to that object. And then own is interesting because while in the line they're saying they're on their own, it also tends to be something that people apply to relationships and the exclusivity of it. So, you might think of your partner as your own and you're theirs, and there's sort of a possessiveness and within that connection. So, they're both on their own as in they're alone, but also if they're thinking about possessiveness, not like in a negative possessiveness, but in terms of literally like possessing an item or possessing a partner as being like they are exclusive to you, that seems to be potentially on the speaker's mind. So yeah, all right, let's jump into the next part. All right, so now we are in our chorus. So let me get my red pen back. So now we're in the chorus, which is obviously repeated throughout the song and has some important information to it. So let's look at the rhymes. We've got feelings and feelings as exact rhymes. For and downpour. Me and sheets sort of has that E sound is sort of repeated throughout them. I'm not seeing any rhyme for ground. Oh no, ground and around, those rhyme. So those go together, those go together, those go together, and those go together, which gives us sort of an A, B, B, A, sort of a C and a C, and then a D, D. Now, as for the actual what's being said in this, we've got they are in their feelings. And what's interesting is that previously they were saying, thinking about our mistakes, but this is entirely all about just themselves. They are alone in their feelings because, it's not we are in our feelings. We're both going through this emotional turmoil. We may be separate, but we're both regretting things we said, etc. This is just, the speaker is just within their feelings. Now, what's also interesting is like rainfall on the ground. Rainfall is, it's in the movement of falling and it's in the sky, but she's actually saying it's like rainfall on the ground, which, implies like a puddle. And it doesn't have movement. And puddles are like, rainfall can be this sort of beautiful flying, falling motion. But if it's already on the ground, then it's a puddle and it's sort of stagnant and, a flooded state too. It's also the quantity of water within a smaller space becomes, you can drown in a puddle, but you can't drown just in a single raindrop that's falling. And here her feelings are like rainfall, so it's a simile. And then these feelings are soaking through the sheets. And this is interesting because it once again brings about these sheets are bed sheets. So we are once again going to those images of nighttime, of restlessness, and also usually in the poetic world when someone's describing either tears or sweat soaking through their sheets, it's usually with sort of a strong, provocative, emotionally provocative dream or nightmare. Someone might wake up in a cold sweat, or if they wake up and their sweat was soaking through the sheets or their tears are soaking through the sheets, they were in a state of heightened emotion. So here we have that, but it's also, again, the simile is going right back and connecting with all the previous imagery we've been having. I'm in my feelings again. It is falling all around, and inside this never-ending downpour is there no escape to hope for. So what's interesting here is that not only are they stating that currently their mental state is never ending. Sorry, that was supposed to be their mind. Their mental state is in a never-ending downpour. But even within that, they're sort of asking and therefore looking for some sort of reprieve. They're not saying there is no escape, like I know 100%, I'm confident there's no escape, I am forever going to dwell in this downpour. But instead, they're kind of asking, is there really no escape? Which means that they still partially hope and believe that there might be an escape. But again, they're not sure. And they're sort of asking in agony, like, is this really all there is? Is this what it's going to be like? Is there no escape? Is there no way to get out of it? But by asking that, they're looking for it. And that's important because it sort of goes back to what we were saying earlier about emotional growth in a character and sort of a trajectory with that character, because that means that ultimately what this character is looking for and what they want, what their objective is some sort of escape from this pain. And whether the escape from this pain will come from, getting back together, or if it will come from forgetting and moving on, we're not sure yet. We do not know how to escape this pain. And I think, that should be all we have to say about this one. And now we will move on to the next verse. All right, and here we have verse 2. And so here we get sort of a tonal change. So previously they were basically like looking at / projecting this ghost, and now they don't even want to look you in the eyes. And eyes here is rhyming with lies. And what's interesting about that is this is sort of a cool and well done rhyme, because not only do the words rhyme, but their meanings are often connected together. If we want the truth, we usually say, look me in the eyes. And usually guilty people can avert their eyes. But also sometimes when you're so hurt, you don't want to look someone in the eyes. And here, Nerissa is thinking about the night you left and your lies. So now we're starting to understand more about what the other person did. So, person B in this example, they both left, but they also lied. And that seems to be one of the main issues that Nerissa has. And that is why she doesn't even want to look them in the eyes anymore, because they're so hurt. And, eye contact can sort of be like a sense of connection and trust. And so if you don't want to make that eye contact anymore, that connection and trust is broken. And again, with guilty, averting the eyes, and look me in the eyes, you look at the eyes for a sense of truth. And so rhyming eyes and lies together is just like a really cool, close rhyming thing. What's also cool is cried. So here Nerissa is talking about, sort of a past tense event of that, she felt like she could drown in all of the tears she cried, when she was crying. But again, it's sort of almost like a close rhyme in a way, because like cries rhymes with eyes and lies, and also tears come from eyes, and tears in the eyes were caused by lies. So it's actually a pretty cool connection of all these words where they either directly rhyme or they're near rhymes, and they also are also like connected in meaning. We also have a rhyme of awoken and broken. And what's also interesting is like a heart can't literally be bruised by, words. It can be bruised in other ways maybe. But so it's sort of a metaphor, but also the use of the word bruised as sort of an adjective is that bruised is sort of a sign of past pain. If you get punched, you don't immediately bruise unless it's like a real, a boxer level. So if you get, hit by something, or you hit your knee on a desk, you first look at your knee and it might just be a little red, but then an hour from then you're going to start to have a bruise. So it's sort of a sign of that sort of past pain. Which is also interesting because we have all this interesting use of like present tense, past tense. Presently she doesn't want to look them in the eyes. She's thinking about the night the person left, so in the past. And then the morning after that night, she woke up and her heart was bruised and broken. And in that moment, she felt like she could drown in the tears she cried. So what's also interesting about this verse is it sort of is projecting us forward in the timeline. So, verse 1, crying, verse 2, reflecting on crying, because in verse 1 they were waiting for daybreak, and now we've seen that eventually that morning did come, but it didn't bring them much solace as they were left bruised and broken. What's also interesting again is this imagery of drowning connects in with all the other imagery. I feel like the two main images here is like ghosts and nighttime, and then like tears, drowning, sort of water imagery, and those both go very hand in hand and connected with each other. So let's jump into the next passage. So here we have another pre-chorus, and here we're continuing with some of that water imagery where she's just saying that she felt like she could drown in her tears. Here it's sinking down and alone, and so this is present tense. So here she's sinking rather than I felt like I could sink. And then simile, like I'm submerged in water, because she's not literally submerged, but instead it's like she's submerged, because what she's really submerged in is her feelings, because she's in her feelings. Chilled straight down to the bone, that also is something that's often described with drowning. So a lot of stories about drowning will have it be in cold water, but also if you're chilled to the bone, that can sort of have to do with a level of shock and degree. So if her significant other in this scenario was suddenly acted so different and was so cruel, it could chill you to the bone. So you get shocked by cold water, and when you're shocked by something, you can feel chilled to the bone. Struggling to breathe just thinking about it, so again, more drowning imagery. And then we go back to the ghost image here, still haunted by the ghost of you. Everywhere I look, it's like you're always there, despite the fact that you left me alone. So what's interesting here is, in a way, the ghost image seems to get an even further negative connotation. While before it was just, I'm thinking about you, I can't sleep, and everywhere I look, I see the ghost of you. Here, we are, the ghost is still there despite the fact that you left me alone, and you left me alone. So now we're starting to see also the speaker is placing blame. So while before it was our mistakes, it is now, you left me. I didn't leave you. It's that sort of thing. What's also sort of interesting about this is we get these S sounds: sinking, submerged, straight, struggling, still, ghost, always, despite the fact that you left me alone. And by having an S sound like that in every line, it sort of contributes to this feeling of being fully like encompassed by this. You're drowning, you're surrounded by water. You can't, you have to be fully submerged in that sense to be drowning in the water, sinking down and down, down alone, submerged. And here, the stanza slash, musical passage, the sort of pre-chorus verse here, it also contributes to that feeling of sort of a relentless being surrounded, because that sound is everywhere. So that's really cool. And then to once again look to words, we get alone and bone. We get alone again here. So also sort of the rhyme scheme itself sort of surrounds and locks you into this feeling and emotion, because then we get words that don't rhyme, like there and you and it and water. These don't rhyme, but their rhymes are placed, very purposefully to lock and sort of neatly connect this whole passage together, so it's something you could truly drown in that sense. Something else that's going on here that's really, really cool in my mind, let me change my font color to help emphasize this, is Nerissa, or the speaker, because we don't know if this is, autobiographical, or if this is, just Nerissa's using creative license and inventing sort of a persona for the song. They are in the act of drowning, which means they are not yet dead. But the other person is a ghost, which means they are already dead. And so there's a sort of degree of like finale, it's over, it's final, it's finished, finality there. And here, Nerissa is still more in a space of transition, and there is the possibility of not drowning. So right now she is sinking, she feels like she's submerged, she's struggling to breathe, but there's still a chance that she could, do a sort of course correct and swim to the surface and get oxygen in her lungs and get over this. But as of right now, she's still in that state of drowning. Something has to happen. There has to be a shift or a change for her to be able to stop drowning. But there is that potential. And so here we have our bridge. Let me get my red pen back. Okay, so here we have our bridge, and it starts off with 3 questions. Who are you seeing? What are you doing? And where are you going? And what's interesting is all these have a slightly different tone, or at least you can interpret them as having a slightly different tone. Who are you seeing seems to have a bit of jealousy, while this one seems to have a bit more of a sense of, a slight tenderness, of where it's like, well, what are you up to? Because, maybe you're also sad. Maybe you're also home sad. So, maybe a bit of tenderness. And then where are you going kind of goes back to the theme of separation, because it's very much, where are you going means that they are going somewhere, they are moving further away. And it's also interesting because within this, it very much feels like, there was Nerissa and then there was this other person. And then Nerissa, the other person, left while Nerissa stayed in the same place. Because all of the imagery is like stuck in bed, haunted, and drowning. It's all very much like a stuck in one place, because even if you're drowning, you're not swimming out of the water, etc. While this person seems to have left somewhere and we don't know where they left. And so these are the questions that are sort of tormenting Nerissa, or again, the speaker of the poem. Then we get, I don't want to know. And then, when are you coming back? And so what's interesting about this question is it almost feels like there is either hope of the other person coming back, or there's sort of a sentiment of maybe this isn't the first time this has happened, because it's almost like she is expecting it. But is that expectation coming from a sense of, this has happened before? Or is this coming from a sense of, one-time trust, and that like, oh, they may be doing all these things, but they'll come back. I'm sure they will. They love me. However, what's also really cool with poetry, and this isn't, as prevalent in songwriting, is punctuation. So in songwriting, some songwriters might just scribble their lyrics down on a legal pad while they're, either playing guitar, and then they set down their guitar pick and quickly scribble out a line. And there isn't as much of an emphasis on punctuation, and we only really see the punctuation when there's like official, song lyric typed up kind of formats. But those official lyrics aren't always actually used by the artist. While in poetry, punctuation is extremely important because poetry is usually presented in a written format. Even when there's like a poetry reading, the person reading it will be able to see the punctuation, and that'll tell them where to emphasize certain things, etc. So for here, something's really interesting. If you put a period here, it feels like they're saying, who are you seeing? What are you doing? Where are you going? I don't want to know. So in that sense, it feels like they are listing off questions that are agonizing them. Like earlier in the song and in the piece, we saw that, this Nerissa character, they aren't able to sleep. They're, tossing and turning in bed. They can hear the clock ticking. They're just waiting for daybreak, but we haven't actually gotten a good sense of the real internal dialogue that is keeping them awake. With this, if you put a period there, you get the sense that these were the thoughts that were agonizing them. They were wondering, are they off with someone else? Are they doing things with that person? Or are they alone and also sad? Are they going somewhere without me? Are they going, somewhere that we used to go with this other person they're seeing, etc.? But here, if you put the period here, then they're saying they don't want to know, which almost feels like it's one of those where, like, if a mutual friend came over, you would want to ask, like, oh, well, who are they seeing? What are they doing? And, where are they going? And the other friend might say, are you sure you want to know? And then you realize, like, wait, never mind. Maybe don't tell me, because the answer to these questions might be too painful. It might only serve to hurt them and make them drown all the more. However, if you take away this period and you just leave it as a space, it almost feels like this question mark is what ends this bracket. So these questions are asked: who are you seeing, what are you doing, and where are you going? And those Nerissa does want the answer to, because the only thing she doesn't want to know the answer to is, when are you coming back? I don't want to know when you're coming back. So what's interesting about that is that almost implies the second narrative that we were talking about whether or not this has happened before. So the first time this happens, you don't want to know the answer of who are they seeing, what are they doing, etc. All you want to know is when they're going to come back. And you may even forgive that person for seeing someone else. If you break up or they're doing infidelity and cheating, because we've seen a theme of lies. So are they lying and they're seeing someone else? Maybe you could forgive all of that. Just tell me when you're coming back so we can go back to normal. However, if that is the thing you don't want to know because you're sick and tired of this cycle, you don't want it to happen again. I don't want to know when you're coming back, but this time you better tell me, who was it that you're seeing? What are you doing and where are you going? Because I'm done with you. And this is kind of these are sort of the last questions for closure. In a way, don't come back, just give me my closure. So it's sort of interesting seeing how punctuation can really drastically alter understanding of this bridge. It's also sort of interesting looking at the rhyme scheme that these questions, since they all rhyme with one another, could hypothetically have been put in any order. You could have said, where are you going, who are you seeing, what are you doing, or what are you doing, who are you seeing, where are you going, etc. But they're placed in this order. And what's sort of, interesting is that sort of both prioritizes the first question that's off of her mind of, is it infidelity, which goes back to the lies. So maybe that's the first thing she wants to know the answer to / doesn't want to know. But also, by putting where you going last, it once again re-emphasizes and re-highlights that theme of separation and of this person left somewhere and left Nerissa / the speaker to kind of rot in bed and eventually drown in their emotions. So, order does matter and punctuation matters, and that's why this type of close reading stuff is so exciting. So now we get to this pre-chorus, and before we jump into it, something that's sort of interesting to highlight is going back to that kind of point of character growth. The sort of journey here seems to be there's this starting point of drowning and all their pain, and then the implied ending point is a resolution, which is getting over it. And this, thus far we've been pretty much stuck in this starting point, but we started to see a bit of growth where they're saying, I don't want to know the answers to these questions, and they're starting to put the blame, you left, I don't want to look you in the eye anymore. They're starting to get closer and closer. But when the chorus comes up and they start saying, well, they're in their feelings and they're drowning again, it's almost like each chorus they get reset and they go back to that starting point. Here, however, I'd say we're the closest we've gotten thus far to this resolution, because here they're saying, I don't want you to call me, I don't need you to love me. So what's interesting about the double use of don't is it can sort of go two different ways. Here, the speaker could either be emphasizing how much they don't want it, so they can either be emphasizing that as like saying it twice, but in stories and fictional portrayals of romance and love, there's also this sort of Shakespearean concept of methinks the lady doth protest too much. So usually this is sort of like if a character, if someone's like, oh hey, do you like so and so, and the person is like, no, never, I would, me and them, that's preposterous, I don't like them at all, in fact I hate them. It's sort of like, that's a little suspicious. It almost kind of sounds like you do like them and you're trying to cover it up and hide. So hypothetically, this doubling down of don't could be a case of Nerissa's character protesting too much, which almost feels like then it is an indication of internal conflict. They're saying, I don't want you to call me, but maybe there's a tiny bit of them that still kind of wants this other person to call them. And, they don't need you. Or, again, it could go with the first interpretation where they're truly doubling down, being nope, I do not need you to love me. So it's sort of open to interpretation. And that's sort of the whole death of the author concept of once it's in the hands of the audience, it's theirs to interpret how they want. However, what we for sure know they don't want is their weak explanations. What's sort of interesting about this line is if Nerissa knows that the explanation is weak, it implies that she's maybe heard it already, which kind of goes back to that sense of, is this just a cycle? Does this person cheat and leave and break up and then come back and give a weak explanation, and the cycle goes on and on and on, and initially she forgives them, it's sort of like, I don't want to know who you were seeing, just come back into my arms? Or is she just so sick of their their shit that she's like, no more, I don't want your weak explanations, I'm just so done with you? An interesting one here is knew that I never met your expectations. Here, I would say that she's not actually being self-deprecating, but it is more a reflection of something that this other person might have said. So in an act of, being cruel, this other person might have said, oh, you never lived up to my expectations. And so now Nerissa is sort of throwing that back into their face and using their hurtful language as sort of like, yeah, I knew I never lived up to your expectations, whatever, get out of here, I'm sick of you. Because here now we finally get some wants. I want you out of my head. I want to move along, carry on, and hold my head high. That it's obviously talking about her wanting to reclaim some of her dignity. And again, it's saying that she wants to move on. However, it's important to note that it doesn't mean she's moved on and carried on. It's just that she wants it. And that's why there's almost this sort of like suspense where they say but, because it's sort of like, hey, I saved the day, but, and it's always like, oh boy, what's going to follow after that? What are they going to say? Is she going to go from this point of almost getting to the ending, but she falls back to that starting place? Or is she going to progress on and get that sort of bit of character growth and move on from this whole saga? Here we also get the rhyme of me and me, explanations and expectations, but then head and high. And so what's interesting about that is, like we said earlier, about how when rhyme schemes break, it's to sort of draw your attention to it. So, because if you're listening to a really long poem and every line rhymes, you sort of get lulled into a bit of a trance and sort of a, it's almost hypnotic in a way. So then if the poet suddenly stops rhyming, it kind of wakes you up out of that trance and you pay more attention to what's going on, because maybe there's like a shift going on here. And that's what I think we see here, where now they're implying an internal shift of wanting this person out of their head. They want to move on, carry on, and hold their head high. So we're seeing that shift even in the rhyme scheme, which is really cool. And again, all of the use of these little subtle shifts and subtle implications are really cool. And we're about to see a really cool usage of this sort of subtlety in the next sort of closing passage of this poem. All right, and so here we have the sort of final chorus and the post-chorus, but I thought it was really cool to compare this final chorus to the last, the last one to the original one, and then this post-chorus, because at first, all of these lines are identical, and they line up with one another, and it seems like it's just going to say the same thing. And since that last verse or pre-chorus that appeared to be implying sort of a change and some character growth, since that ended on a but, when you get to this chorus, you're going to think, oh no, this character is going to be back in their feelings, drowning, and there won't be any escape. But right at the end, there's this shift where the never-ending downpour becomes she's at now the ending of the downpour. And here she has found the hope that she waited for. While before, it was like, is there no escape to even hope for? She found that hope. And so it's really cool because a lot of times with poetry, people think that poetry doesn't have any plot and doesn't have any sort of conflict resolution in that way, or talking about things like character growth. But here in this poem and in this song, we get character growth, we get that resolution. We have conflict at first, we have a character who wants to overcome the conflict, and then we get the resolution. And there really is a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is just really, really cool to see in a poem. It's also cool how the sentence structure again changes, where we still have the but, or we have the is here, but here with the shift we get the but again from earlier, but it's a pivot into the positive. And so then it ends with this post-chorus of like, yeah, I'm still in my feelings, yeah, I'm in my feelings, but at the ending of these feelings, there is the rainbow I had prayed for. And that past tense implies that in the present tense, the character has overcome this grief, this pain, this brooding, and this struggling and everything. And so, again, looking back at this whole sort of poem, song as a whole, we've seen so many cool things going on. We had our Byronic hero as sort of the main subject. We've had this interconnectionness of sort of gothic imagery to describe internal conflict, of being in the feelings as being, it's internal. And the way that the sort of bedroom with this bed that the character was struggling to sleep in, it almost feels like the walls of this bedroom where they can't see the daybreak was their emotions, and their tears were filling up this bedroom and causing them to drown and be fully encompassed within the suffering and agony. But then this downpour of tears gets this imagery of a rainbow, and rainbows come at the end of rain when the downpour stops. So now that they've found the rainbow, it also means that they are no longer within the downpour. The downpour has ended, because otherwise you wouldn't be getting that rain. And so having such a subtle change in this sort of chorus, but that it reveals so much, it's just really, really cool. And again, it was awesome how all the metaphors and imagery all clicked together and worked to really build up this sort of gothic imagery of drowning and ghosts, and how a ghost is already dead and drowning is an act of dying. Because here we see that there would have been a reality where if the song had just ended on this chorus instead of this one, it would have been a story about someone who kept drowning until they eventually died. But instead, we get one where there is this but, there's this shift, and they come up out of it, and they're better for it. Now they're in a rainbow, and they're, not just daybreak, but they get a rainbow. And so it's just really, really, really cool. So, yeah, I think that's about going to wrap up this close reading. I really hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. I have a lot of fun recording these. I totally understand that these videos are extremely niche, but you know, if you got to the end of this, you definitely have what it takes to pursue an English degree, because this is what that branch of study is all about. It's kind of fun geeking out over language and doing these sort of annotations. So if you enjoyed this, you know, it means so much if you could subscribe, because then you'll be able to see when I post more of these. And let me know in the comments if you agree with all of my interpretations. The other cool thing about poetry is there can be a million different ways to interpret a line, and everyone sort of gets a different meaning or story out of the piece, and it's usually personal to them. So I'd love to hear about what your guys' thoughts are on this, and if you have any suggestions for other songs or weird pieces of media. I'm hoping to eventually, you know, kind of look at video game characters and Shakespearean archetypes and seeing how those sort of tie together. But yeah, I think I'll wrap this up here. So take care, and I will see you in the next video.